My name is Susan Warsinger, and I'm a Holocaust survivor and volunteer at the museum. It is my honor to welcome you on behalf of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum to today's program, How Did FDR's Leadership Shape American Responses to the Nazi Threat? I'd also like to welcome our digital audience. We invite you to share your reflections and questions for today's program using the hashtag AskWhy. Today's program is part of a larger conversation that the museum is holding in towns and cities nationwide to explore what our country's citizens and leadership knew and how they responded in the 1930s and during the Holocaust. After Kristallnacht, on November the 10th, 1938, my parents realized that our family needed to get out of Germany. Our dream was to come to the United States. However, we could not get the necessary papers to immigrate because of the strict quotas that were imposed by the United States government. In 1939, my father found a French lady who smuggled children over the border from Germany into France. She had 2 children of her own and used their passports to smuggle my brother Joe and me into Paris. It must have been dreadful for my parents to send us away, not knowing if they would ever see their 2 children again. In 1940, after the German army occupied most of France, we lost contact with my mother and father. My brother and I were transported to the Château de Morel, run by the Osé, a home for refugee Jewish children in the unoccupied zone of France. My parents and my baby brother Ernest were able to immigrate in 1940 to the United States because my father had cousins who owned a pickle factory in the Bronx. These cousins promised the State Department that they would support my parents so that they would not be a burden to the United States. When my parents finally arrived in the United States, they immediately tried to find us. They asked the American Friends Service Committee, which is a Quaker-affiliated organization, and the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, the highest, to help find us. How they were able to do this is a miracle. These organizations eventually must have been in touch with the United States Committee for the Care of European Children, which FDR asked Eleanor Roosevelt to head. After a year of corresponding and much pleading from my parents to these organizations, my brother and I were finally granted our visas to the United States. Our trip started by train to Marseille, then through the Pyrenees, through Spain, and on to Lisbon, Portugal, where on September the 9th, 1941, we boarded a ship called the Serpa Pinto with 50 other USCOM children that Eleanor Roosevelt saved from the horrors of the Holocaust. I am grateful to Eleanor Roosevelt, the Quakers, and the Hayes for helping me. My father wrote to the AFC, this is what he said, "There are absolutely no words that we can think of that could possibly express our appreciation for your kind work." At the museum's dedication 25 years ago, our founding chair, the late Elie Wiesel, said, "The museum is not an answer, it's a question." Elie's words embody how this institution has approached its work for the past quarter century. We explore some of the most complex questions about Holocaust history, and we never stop asking why. We're helping audiences think about issues like, Why are some people vulnerable to recruitment by extremist ideologies? Why do some people take risks to help others? Why do societies fail? These are complicated questions. As the museum marks its 25th anniversary in 2018, we will launch an engagement initiative called Never Stop Asking Why, to start a global multi-generational conversation that motivates people to consider the most complex questions about the Holocaust and its relevance today. The next set of complicated issues and questions that the museum will be considering focus on the United States and its response to Nazi brutality. Today, we are pleased to provide a preview of a new and groundbreaking special exhibition opening in April 2018 called Americans and the Holocaust. Through the exhibition and National Education Initiative, we will explore questions like, what did Americans know about the rising Nazi threat? What were the fears, pressures, and motivations that influenced individual and collective responses to events in Europe? Today, we are fortunate to have a distinguished historian here to explore the figure of President Roosevelt during his presidency and the Holocaust, and how his influence is felt today. Dr. Robert Dallek, a best-selling author, addresses the subject in a new book, Franklin D. Roosevelt, A Political Life. We are also fortunate to have as a moderator the museum's very own Dr. Rebecca Erbelding, one of the museum's historians and author of the forthcoming book, Rescue Board, the Untold Story of America's Efforts to Save the Jews of Europe. Before we welcome our guests to the stage, please take a look at this video introducing Americans and the Holocaust.
People are shocked to find out how much news there was about Nazism, how early Americans learned about what the Nazis called the final solution, and what they did about it. America has its own prejudices. Anti-Semitism, racism and segregation, political fears, fear of communism. There's deep fear of spies. The depth of the Depression, I think, is hard for people to imagine today. 25% unemployment in America, people starving. All right, so we're trying to figure out how to help visitors understand what a crisis point in 1938 is for refugees, right?
We've been doing some newspaper research, trying to look for some headlines.
This one's good. Nations fear flow of Jews from Europe.
As the Nazis are expanding, our doors are closing even more. Americans are asked, right after Kristallnacht, do you disapprove of Nazism? And 94% of Americans say they disapprove of Nazism. And then they're asked, so should we allow a larger number of Jewish exiles to come to the US? And more than 70% say no.
The Office of War Information had such amazing posters.
But still, that you don't see a reference to Jews in a poster like this. Now we're in the height of mass killing of Jews. By November 1942, it's public information in America. But that is not the cause we're fighting for. There was a Nazi threat that most Americans understood as a threat to democracy, and they went to war to defeat it militarily, but never to rescue the victims of Nazism. FDR and his administration believed the way to stop the killing is to stop the killers. This history teaches us a lot about the power of individuals. There are individuals in this exhibition who take extraordinary risks.
This is a letter written September 4th, 1939. She's writing to a total stranger, begging for help.
What would you do if you got a letter from a stranger who wanted help? Or would you be willing to take the risk to go to Europe and aid refugees. The special exhibitions that we've done have really focused on victims and perpetrators. This one is different. This is about Americans. What did Americans know? When did they know it? What did we do about it? What were the range of American responses to the threat of Nazism?
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. I hope that video gives you a little bit of a taste of what the museum is planning to do in the next few years. Our exhibit will open in April 2018, as Susan said, and we hope that you'll come back for more programs and come back when our exhibit finally opens. So this is one of our first major public programs getting into the questions of what did Americans know and when did they know it. And FDR looms so large in this history that we were so fortunate that such a renowned presidential historian happened to be writing a biography on the subject. And so we can get your advice and your counsel here at this moment. So my first question is, FDR is really such a meaty subject, but he's also a very difficult person to study. He didn't leave a diary, he didn't live to write his memoirs. So what made you decide that now was the time for a new biography of Roosevelt, and how did you approach the juggler, as he called himself?
Yes, thank you very much. You know, I was invited by a publisher, and I raised the same questions with them. I said, there's been such a rich literature about Roosevelt and documentary collections. And they said, but yes, it's been 8 years since anyone published a one-volume study of Franklin Roosevelt. And in addition, young people have lost track of what these events were about and what Roosevelt and the country faced in the 1930s and 40s. And so, while I didn't imagine that this book was going to provide dramatically new evidence about any domestic or foreign policy issue in particular, I aimed it mainly at young people in the sense that I want them to recall that it's not the first time in American history that the country has gone through difficulties, and that we've managed to surmount them, and that they should understand the leadership. And because there's so much cynicism now about our current politics, I think it's well that they should remember what an effective leader and a country dealing with both domestic and international horrors dealt with.
Yeah, I think Americans, especially since Watergate, tend to forget that the president was such a leader, and FDR in 1933 was the big hope of most of the nation, and not cynically at all.
No.
And so your book is as much about the context of everything really around FDR as it is about FDR. But one of the main threads, and you say it pretty starkly in the book, is that FDR's self-confidence and feeling of his own will was so strong that he felt he could carry so much of the country on his back.
Yes.
Can you kind of speak to that and how FDR changes over the course of his life? Was that always there with him?
Well, remember, he was a patrician who came to the presidency with the sense that he deserved to be president. Indeed, his idea of the presidency was Franklin Roosevelt in the White House. And his distant cousin Theodore had served with great success and was remembered affectionately by millions and millions of Americans. But what we also need to remember is that Roosevelt suffered this paralyzing polio attack at the age of 39 in 1921. And I think it helped to humanize him, to deepen his sense of reaching out to people who were unfortunate, who had been disabled in some way. And I think it was a powerful element in also driving his ambition. He wanted to overcome that disability. And of course, it is an amazing story that here's a man who was paralyzed from the waist down and served for over 12 years in the White House. And you know, he also had a wonderful sense of humor, if I may just tell this anecdote. One day, Ben Cohen, who had been his part of his brain trust, came in the Oval Office, and Roosevelt was chuckling. And Cohen said to him, "Mr. President, would you mind sharing the joke with me?" And Roosevelt said, "All right, Ben, I'll tell you. Eleanor was just in here. She had been to her doctor this morning for her annual physical. And so when she came in, I said to her, 'So, Eleanor, what did the doctor have to say about that big ass of yours?' And she said, 'Franklin, he had nothing at all to say about you.'" It kept them going through difficult times.
Well, and that's, you know, one of the fascinating things I think for historians about Roosevelt is that even his disease doesn't give him a sense or a feeling of vulnerability. And he uses this self-confidence in his relationship with the press, which he manipulates constantly to his will. Can you talk a little bit about his relationship with the press?
Yeah. He had an extraordinary relationship with the journalists. See, the newspaper publishers disliked him and were very critical of the New Deal and of his leadership. But he would hold, believe it or not, 2 press conferences a week. And he would sit in his chair in the Oval Office, and the reporters would gather around him. And he would begin by saying, "Well, boys, nothing today, but," and then off the record, and he'd start telling them something that they enjoyed hearing. And then at the end of the interview or the discussion, he'd say, "Well, boys, I got to run." And of course, he couldn't walk. And yet it was part of his image making that his objective was to create the sense of someone who was in charge, who was a really effective leader, you see. There are no surviving photographs of Franklin Roosevelt's disability, you see. The only time in his 12 years in the White House that he ever made reference to his polio was when he came back from Yalta in February 1945. And he spoke to a joint session of the Congress, and he said, "I know you will forgive me for sitting down, but I've just come back from a journey of over 10,000 miles, and I carry 10 pounds of steel around each of my lower limbs." Now, it's the only time he ever made reference to his disability. Out of camera shot, he would be carried like a baby, you see. He'd go on these destroyers or cruisers for a sea voyage, and they would go on a fishing skiff, and he had to be carried like a child onto the smaller boat, you see. But he was always smiling and waving. And we know from behind-the-scenes materials, and in particular, there is a diary that was kept by a woman named Margaret Daisy Suckley, who is his distant cousin. But they loved each other. And he would say to her, "Daisy, I'm going to say this to you, but I know you won't repeat it to anyone else." And while he was very hidden, very difficult to read, and Harold Ickes, the wonderful Secretary of the Interior, once said to him, "You're the hardest damn man to work for." And Roosevelt said, "Why? Because I'm so tough?" And Ickes said, "No, because you play your cards so close to your vest," see. And so he was very difficult to read, and that was on purpose on his part. Morgenthau said to him, also complained, and Roosevelt said, "Well, I always keep my right hand below the table." And he said, "Well, what happens to your left hand?" He said, "Oh, that's for you, Henry." And he would exude charm. And a last point, as Winston Churchill said after he died, meeting Roosevelt for the first time was like uncorking a bottle of champagne.
Well, and Churchill, of course, was stunned when he first met Roosevelt as to how disabled he was, because the public image just wasn't there, and that was part of his relationship with the press, is that they had this deal that they would not photograph him, they would not allude to his disability. So one of the very important people in Roosevelt's life, whether he liked it or not sometimes, was Eleanor.
Absolutely.
You know, Eleanor is the voice of conscience for him a lot of the time, always needling him to do a little bit more humanitarian, make a little more of a humanitarian effort. And I've heard her referred to as his legs. But they had a very interesting and somewhat fraught marriage. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. She found out in 1918 that he had been having an affair with her social secretary. And who knows, maybe he wanted her to find out because she was unpacking his trunk after coming back from a trip abroad, and she found these letters that were there. And she offered him a divorce. But Franklin's mother, Sarah, and Louis Howe, who was Roosevelt's, of course, most forceful and influential advisor, told him that this will destroy your political career because nobody who gets divorced is ever going to reach high office in this country, you see. And so they reached a kind of accommodation, and they were a team. But they both had very public lives, you see. It wasn't their private lives that drove them or animated them, but they were both public figures. And of course, she was the greatest first lady, in my judgment, in American history. And as you said, quite accurately, I think she was the voice of his conscience. And there were a handful of people on the left. And she pushed him in the direction of being more humane, you see. And he said at one point in 1936, better a government that lives in a spirit of charity than one frozen in the ice of its own indifference. And the great achievement, I think, of his New Deal was not that it ended the Depression, because it was industrial mobilization for the war that did that, but rather he humanized the American capitalist system. And one can go through all those alphabet agencies like the FDIC and the, I become speechless in trying to recall all these agencies that he set up that reached millions of people and made their lives better. And the best evidence of this that I could give has to do with African Americans, because he was never an open public advocate of their advance, their progress. And in fact, he wouldn't support an anti-lynching bill that kept coming up in the Congress. And he averted talking about that. But the irony is that by the end of his presidency, black voters had moved from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. And the saying was, turn Lincoln's face to the wall, you see. And I have heard a folk song by an African-American steel guitarist. And he wrote this song, which was Franklin Roosevelt, the poor man's friend, see. And this is the way they viewed him. And ever since then, of course, as, dare I mention it, witnessed yesterday, black voters can make a huge difference in this in these elections.
Mm-hmm. And Eleanor played a huge role in that because she was very vocal in support of African American equality at the time. I want to transition a little bit to the reason that we're here at the Holocaust Museum today, which is Roosevelt's reaction to the Nazi threat. As you saw, the museum's opening a new exhibit in April about what Americans knew about this. FDR really sees the Nazi threat earlier, I think, than most people. And he and Hitler are really interesting together as contemporaries. They both come to power in their respective countries in early 1933. They're both facing very similar challenges of economic depression and insecurity, and they both die within weeks of each other in April 1945. When did Roosevelt start to see Hitler as a threat and Nazism as a threat, and how does he respond in the early 1930s?
Well, he saw this threat very early on. And he sent as his ambassador to Nazi Germany a man named William E. Dodd, who was a historian from the University of Chicago and was a Wilsonian Democrat and had written the first short biography of Woodrow Wilson. And Dodd would correspond with Roosevelt. The State Department didn't like him because they saw him as unprofessional. But his concern was the fact that the Nazis and Hitler were a threat to current civilization in the 1930s. And he would write Roosevelt about the horrors he felt were in store for the world and as a result of Hitler's power. And Roosevelt took him very seriously. The State Department wanted him out, but Roosevelt kept him there because he was giving what Roosevelt felt was the essential message. And of course, when he later sent Joseph Kennedy to Great Britain as the ambassador to the Court of St. James, at first he chuckled and said, "I'd love to see the faces of those English noble folks when this red-headed Irishman shows up at the Court of St. James," you see. But quickly he became disillusioned with Kennedy, who, of course, was an appeaser, you see. Now, Roosevelt, at the end of the day, he was a careful politician. His concern was to sustain national consensus support for himself, for the Democrats, and the issues that agitated him and that he didn't want to have a public face about was immigration, rescuing Jews. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in the country. And Eleanor, privately, came to Roosevelt when there were 80 Portuguese Jews who were trying to get into the United States. And Breckinridge Long, who was the Assistant Secretary of State in charge of these matters, was blocking their entrance. And Eleanor went to Franklin and said it was essential to let them in for their survival. And she said to Franklin, "This man Long is a fascist." And Roosevelt said to her, "Eleanor, you must not say that." And she said, "But it's true, you see." And she prodded him. She pushed him to speak out, and he didn't. He didn't speak out, but he was sympathetic to what she was saying. And in 1938, after Kristallnacht, he said privately, "This man Hitler is a maniac with a mission." So he knew early on that.
Well, but at the same time, he doesn't push Congress to expand immigration quotas. And there's a slide that I'm hoping that we can pull up here. So Congress sets immigration quotas in 1924. They don't change throughout the 1930s. There are no new laws to keep Jews out of the US imposed in the 1930s. That's all the 1924 laws. And what the 24 law did is establish quotas for each country of birth. So it didn't matter if you were born in Germany but had become a Dutch citizen, you were coming under this German quota. This set group of, after 1938, 27,370 available immigration slots for people born in Germany. And you can see on this slide that as of January 1939, there's 240,000 people on that list, a 9-year wait. And Germany is the second highest quota of any country in the world. Romania, you can see, is a 43-year wait if you want to come and immigrate from Romania, which isn't even under Nazi occupation yet. But Roosevelt, Even after Kristallnacht, he lets in people who are here visiting, Jews who are here and happen to be in the US visiting. When Kristallnacht happens, he says, I can't in any good conscience send them home. But when the press asks him, so are we considering raising the immigration quotas? He said, no, that's not under consideration at this time. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to what constraints, you answered it a little bit, but more directly, what constraints he's under in 1938,
well,
1939.
He spoke to Sam Rayburn, a Texas congressman from Bottom, Texas, who was a leading figure in the House of Representatives, about the possibility of reforming the immigration statutes and the quotas. And he was told by congressional leadership, don't touch it. Mm-hmm. You're not going to get anywhere. It's going to be opposed. See, people thought that, especially during World War II, there was the conviction that at the end of the war, when the millions of troops were mustered out and they came home, that it was going to create a tremendous surge of unemployment. And they were afraid that the country would fall into another depression. And the attitude was, you know, we don't want to take people in who are just going to be part of this whole depressed economy and live off the public dole, you see. So the circumstances, the conditions were such that he understood that it was politically very unwise, not to mention also, as I said before, the anti-Semitism, which was widespread in the country at the time.
Yeah, one of the things that we've been doing for the exhibit is looking at polling information. And in January 1939, exactly when those statistics were happening, exactly when that was the waiting list to get into the US, 83% of Americans say that they don't want any more European refugees. And the reasons that they give are these unemployment reasons. There's got to be a tinge of anti-Semitism in there too.
Sure. Probably
more than a tinge. But even an attempt, which Eleanor Roosevelt supports, to bring in refugee children in 1939, it doesn't even make it out of congressional committee because people say these children are going to grow up and they're going to take jobs. And at that point, we're at 17% unemployment.
Right. And as late as 1944, when they asked in a Gallup poll, do you believe the Nazis are committing atrocities? 76% of the poll said yes. But how many people do you think they are killing, in essence, in the concentration camps? Only 4%, only 4% thought it was millions of people. Most people thought it was maybe 100,000 people. Mm-hmm. They just, and of course, as you well know, the term Holocaust doesn't come into existence until the end of the war.
Yeah, FDR never knows it as a Holocaust. It's the particularly brutal part of the war and untangling the crimes of the Holocaust. The two wars that Hitler was fighting is something that really happens largely at the end of the war and after it. And there's another concern beyond unemployment, beyond anti-Semitism, and that's that by 1939, Americans are fairly convinced there is going to be a world war.
Yes.
And so I want to play a few clips, if I can. The first one is from a fireside chat that FDR gave on September 3rd, 1939, which is the day that France and Great Britain declared war on the US. Do we have the radio clip? Germany. Yes. No, you're right. Thank you. Thank you. I always like a well-informed crowd. If we can find the slide. If not, I can try to do an FDR impression, but you're not going to like it. All right, I don't hear the audio, which, you know, is FDR would not have liked that because he loved speaking on the radio. That was his medium, and that was the way that most Americans saw him. But he says in 1939, as you can read, this nation will remain a neutral nation, but I can't expect Americans to remain neutral in thought. And then skipping down, I hope America will keep out of this war, and I believe that it will, and the government will be directed towards keeping out of the war. 2 years later, it's a very different message. September 1941, he gives another chat. This is in the wake of the attack on the USS Greer, which was to some extent an attack that the US pushed for to try. I mean, the boat is out in enemy territory and gets attacked. And Roosevelt says, we've sought no shooting war with Hitler. We don't seek it now, but we don't want peace so much that we are willing to pay for it by permitting Hitler to attack our naval and merchant ships. When you see a rattlesnake posed to strike, you don't wait until he's struck before you crush him. So he really tries to turn the nation, and uses a lot of political capital to do it, to turn the nation from isolation to internationalism and prepare a very isolationist nation, the majority of whom do not want to go to war, right. To war. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about how he managed to do that.
Well, the proposition by which he operated foreign affairs was that if you're going to expend blood and treasure, you need to have a stable political consensus for those commitments. And he was loath to sign into law the neutrality statutes of 1935, 37, but this is where public opinion was at, and he was not going to boldly run counter to it. Now, behind the scenes, he was much more receptive to the idea of cooperating, and in fact, when Italy attacked Ethiopia in 1935, he invoked the neutrality law because it was going to punish Italy, because the law forbid loans to a belligerent, forbid transport of munitions to a belligerent, you see, and forbid Americans from traveling on belligerent ships. Well, the Ethiopians didn't have any ships, but the Italians had plenty of ships that were carrying Americans across the ocean, you see. And so he saw this as a way to punish Italy for its aggression. But he was cautious, always very cautious about overstepping the bounds of what politics would allow. In 1941, shortly before Pearl Harbor, the British ambassador came to him and asked him to ask Congress for a declaration of war against Germany and Italy, see. And he said, I could do it, and I could get majority votes, but he was reluctant because at the first sign of a setback, it was going to shatter the consensus for fighting. This was his anxiety. And you know, Harry Truman found this to be true in 1951, 52, when we got into the stalemate in Korea. His approval rating went down to 32%. Lyndon Johnson, overwhelmed by the loss of public support in the Vietnam War. And so Roosevelt, Pearl Harbor was a godsend for him. Now, this is not to suggest that he in any way at all engineered this. It was a genuine surprise. And the best book on that, I think, that's ever been written was by Roberta Wohlstetter, called Pearl Harbor, Warning and Decision, a national failure to anticipate, see. So, but remember, he was a master politician, and this is the way he presided over this shift from isolationism to internationalism. And during the war, if I may just add this, during the war, when there was a love fest for China, for Russia, and you may recall that Wendell Willkie, who had been his opponent in the 1940 election, Roosevelt sent him on a world tour, and partly to get him out of the country so he couldn't run against him in 1944. But Willkie came back and wrote a book called One World, and published in March of '43. It became the greatest overnight nonfiction bestseller in American history. The hopes I have for my book, but not to be realized. Anyway, Wilkie, in that book, his argument was that inside of every foreigner is an American waiting to emerge, you see. Everybody wanted to become like the United States, you see. And Roosevelt played up this idealism, when in fact, he was a real politician. He has been criticized for having been soft on dealing with Stalin. In 1944, the Quebec Conference with Churchill, they came back to Hyde Park, New York, Roosevelt's ancestral home, and they signed an aide-memoire, which hid the secret of the atomic bomb from Stalin, see. Stalin didn't care because there were spies in the Manhattan Project, and he already knew the US was building an atomic bomb. But it speaks volumes about Roosevelt, the real politician, who, on the face of it, is talking about our great Soviet allies and comrades. And of course, people loved the Soviets at that point. They had torn the guts out of the Nazi war machine at a phenomenal sacrifice of over 25 million lives. And so Roosevelt, again, he's the master politician, you see, who understands how to shift opinion in the country, not by being direct or open, but by practicing a kind of manipulation and stealth.
Yeah, and I think that's tends to be our argument about Roosevelt and the refugee crisis, is that he takes what we call significant but limited measures to help. Eleanor makes a push for more, Roosevelt makes a political calculation. And that's where we have the debate over what more could have been done. You make the argument in your book that once the war begins, mass rescue is really impossible. Do you see other places that he could have done more in your study of Roosevelt?
Well, my impression is that the Nazis, Hitler, was so determined to exterminate the Jews that even as the war was winding down and they desperately needed slave labor to work in the munitions factories, they wanted to keep the gas chambers going, or at least he did, and his Nazi functionaries did, you see. And it was an obsession with them about, it's impossible to understand that a formerly civilized nation like this could have descended into such barbarism. And that's why this museum is a great landmark, it seems to me, to remind people. I visited this museum twice before I came here today, and each time, at the end of my visit, I saw young girls, high school students, in the vestibule sobbing. They had gone through the museum, and it struck them as to what the horrors were that had been perpetrated. And it's true, the museum's bumper sticker, so to speak, we mustn't forget, we must remember. And young people I teach still for Stanford University in Washington, and I have these 20-year-old students. You have to educate them. They have to learn about the country's history, because now World War II, the Holocaust is and even if you ask them about nuclear weapons, I know when I was teaching in the 1980s, there was so much anxiety among students about the potential for a nuclear war, but it's diminished now. And yet, I have an Israeli friend who said to me, "You think the world's going to live for the next 5,000 years without using one of these nuclear weapons?" And I leave it to greater minds than mine to answer that.
So I'm going to ask two more questions and then open it up for all of your questions, so please start thinking about them. Let's move towards the end of FDR's life. One of your main arguments in the book is that FDR is far sicker for far longer. really by the time the war begins, and then of course by 1944, he's pretty much actively dying, I think. How do you think this manifested in his decisions, especially in the last year of his life?
Yeah, there's no question that his health had gone into sharp decline. What I found was that in 1940, as he was sitting in the dining room of his Hyde Park home and receiving the returns for that 1940 election, he suddenly turned to his Secret Service guy and said, "Close the door and don't let anybody in." And he said, "Not Mrs. Roosevelt." He said, "I said nobody." He was sweating profusely, he was in great pain, and there were subsequent episodes in which he would lie on the floor, writhing in pain from angina attacks. And he was suffering from congestive heart failure, you see. In 1944, when he ran for that fourth term, there's no question, he was dying, and Winston Churchill's physician, Lord Moran, saw him at Yalta in February '45 and wrote in his diary, "The president is suffering from hardening of the arteries of the brain. He'll be dead in a few months' time." And he called it right on the mark, you see. If the war were over, I don't think Roosevelt ever would have run again, because the opinion polls at the time showed that with the war continuing, they still wanted Roosevelt in the White House. But he said to this Daisy Suckley I mentioned before, that if the war ended in '45, he would only serve for 1 year in this fourth term, and then he wanted to resign and become the head of an international peace organization, you see. So he knew that the end might be in sight, but his attitude was, so many millions of people have perished in this conflict, and that if this is my sacrifice, you know, I'm, as James McGregor Burns used the title of his second volume, Soldier of Freedom. And in a sense, that's what he saw himself as, a soldier.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, when he dies, when Roosevelt dies on April 12th, 1945, his name is listed in the fallen soldiers in the newspaper.
Exactly.
I want to point out this photo. So this is FDR at Yalta. FDR had just turned 63. He was not an old man, but he ages so much throughout his presidency, and you see how sick he is. You don't expect a man in his 60s to look like that. So right before we open up to questions, your book is very long. It is over 600 pages long, very long, but FDR lives for the vast majority of the book. You document his death on April 12th, a page and a half before the book ends. And I'm wondering if you knew from the beginning that you were going to end that way. You lay out the war, the United Nations, the development of the bomb, and then never close those stories, because FDR doesn't close those stories. And I'm wondering what decision went into ending like that, not to give it away.
I'm 83 years old, and I wanted to get done with the book. Because you never know. My father lived to be 95, so I hope I keep going for a while. But, you know, I wanted to end there, but there are two wonderful anecdotes I love to tell about after he died. Somebody stopped Mrs. Roosevelt on the street and said to her, "I miss the way your husband used to speak to me about my government." See? Who can imagine any politician today, people saying that? Well, the man who stood by the railway track as the body was being transported from Warm Springs to Hyde Park, New York, and the man was sobbing, and somebody next to him said, "Did you know the president?" And he said, "No, but he knew me." What a telling thing as to a connection to a president. He was no saint, you know, and he will never live down, in a sense, the moral failing of not having been outspoken about the Holocaust, of having raised for generations to come what horrors had been perpetrated, and that we needed to understand that it was impermissible for a civilized society to behave in this way. And so this will haunt his reputation ever since. But there's a wonderful book by the historian William Luchtenberg called In the Shadow of FDR. And he remains, I think, one of the three great presidents of American history, along with George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Though it fascinates me is I published a book in 2003 on John Kennedy, An Unfinished Life, and it had a huge sale. And the polls show when you ask people about Kennedy, he has an 85% approval rating, see, as if he were a great president. And so much depends on current mood in the country as to the way in which these historical figures are viewed. And my teacher was a man named Richard Hofstadter, great historian, and he used to say that presidential reputations go up and down like the stock market, you see. Now, at some point, they get locked in. I don't think Calvin Coolidge has much shifting about of his standing these days, although it's fascinating what Ron Chernow has been able to do with Ulysses S. Grant, you see. So you never know. But anyway, it's, as the saying goes, history is argument without end. And so people will be arguing about FDR 100 years from now.
Well, it strikes me that your book might have been titled Franklin Roosevelt, An Unfinished Legacy, because he reverberates through so much of the U.S. And love him or hate him, he is still present in our country today, all of the things that he did in his 12 years.
I'll end by saying I have 4 grandchildren who are 14, 11, 6, and 4, and they're all rooting for me or for my book because it helps to pay their private school's tuition.
I'll plug the book in a minute. I do want, if people have questions, there's a microphone right there, and yes.
Wonderful talk. The event was right there is described as responses to the Nazi threat, singular. But would it be fair to say that Roosevelt perceived at least 2 different Nazi threats, one to the United States and one to Jews throughout the world, and his confronting these separate threats was a very delicate balance. But my question is there any evidence that he feared that any emphasis on the Holocaust as a factor in our war against Germany might compromise the war effort by encouraging the image that preventing or ending the Holocaust was a key motive in the war against Germany?
Yeah. Well, it's a very interesting question, and I think a quite interesting and legitimate way to ask about this. Because remember that this is an evolving situation, you see. You're going from prejudice, rumors of nastiness, of ugliness, until you get to Kristallnacht in 1938. And then Roosevelt pulls his ambassador out of Germany because he's saying it's impermissible for a civilized nation to act this way. But the last thing he wanted to do was to have people in the United States assume that we were going to war to rescue the Jews, you see. He thought that would have been hugely unpopular. And again, I come back to the point that Pearl Harbor was a godsend. And what's interesting to me is that when you look at the opinion polling data at the end of the war about punishing war criminals, the emphasis for most Americans was on punishing the Japanese leadership. And they talked about torturing them, imprisoning them, beating them, and Hitler, of course, was dead by then, and it wasn't as if they wanted to give the Nazi leadership an easy ride, but it was something that he knew The country did not want to, and in fact, somebody once said to me, you cannot find a photograph of Franklin Roosevelt with just a priest, a minister, or a rabbi. It's always ecumenical. They're together, you see. And so he's not favoring any particular religious camp. And I think that speaks volumes about his perception of where the public was at.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say that he definitely didn't want it to be seen as a war for the Jews. Nobody really wanted it to be perceived that way. And when the first report on Auschwitz reached the US in November 1944, the Auschwitz protocols finally made it here in its full copy. The War Refugee Board, which was Roosevelt's agency to try to rescue Jews, offered it to the War Department and said, do you want to publicize this in Yank magazine, which was the magazine for soldiers? And they rejected it as too Semitic. So the report on Auschwitz was too Semitic. The soldiers might see it, and the soldiers might feel that this was, that's what they were secretly being asked to fight for. And so there were a lot of political calculations in making sure that American propaganda recognized that this was a fight for democracy, not a fight for Jews.
Well, politics was never far from Roosevelt's mind, and the best example, or one better examples I can give is, he sends to China in 1944 as his ambassador a man named Patrick Hurley. Patrick Hurley had been Herbert Hoover's Secretary of War. He was an Oklahoma businessman. He did not know diddle about China. When he wrote a letter to Chiang Kai-shek, he addressed him as Dear Mr. Shek. And Roosevelt sent him there because he was a conservative Republican, and Roosevelt wanted to promote a unity government, a coalition between the communists and the nationalists. And if that failed, he was going to blame it on Patrick Hurley, you see. So there's always political machinations behind what he's doing.
Okay, let's go over here next.
Thank you. Concerning moving Breckinridge Long out of his position in late 1943-44, you had mentioned earlier that Eleanor Roosevelt had warned Roosevelt that Breckinridge Long was an anti-Semite. And aside from Henry Morgenthau being a primary driver in moving out Breckinridge Long, was there anybody else warning Roosevelt about him? And did the part that Breckinridge Long play in the Bermuda Conference, did that have any effect on Roosevelt's decision to finally move him out and create the War Refugee Board?
I can take this.
Well, you could.
Yeah, I can take this. So Breckinridge Long really damns himself at the end of 1944. Peter Bergson, who was a Palestinian activist, had been raising awareness about the Holocaust and about the mass murder of the Jews throughout 1943. He stages pageants and rallies, puts full-page newspaper ads in major American newspapers, and convinces congressional supporters to introduce resolutions calling on Roosevelt to form some sort of commission, government commission, to try to rescue Jews. Breckinridge Long testifies in a congressional hearing on one of those resolutions in a secret session. The session goes so well that he decides unilaterally that he's going to release the transcript of his testimony, thinking that that will make everyone pressuring the government for action to stop pressuring the State Department to do any more. If they only knew what great things the State Department had been doing, they would shut up about trying to encourage more. His testimony is false. He claimed that the US had accepted 580,000 refugees, which is absurd. It's about a quarter of that in reality. So Breckinridge Long, this testimony is released in December 1944, so the exact same time that the Treasury Department is formulating its dossier really against State Department rescue efforts. So it's the combination of these public and private things that really convince Roosevelt that it's time to switch horses at this point in terms of who's responsible for refugee matters.
Wasn't the War Refugee Board set up before December 44?
It was set up in January 44.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, I might have said 44. I meant 43. The testimony's in 43, just November 43. Yes.
So I want to pursue further the issue of when did Roosevelt have information indicating that mass murders were occurring in the concentration camps? And did he not do anything about it, partly because he was concerned with too much sympathy for the Jews, and therefore he wanted to keep it on, democracy, saving democracy, and not, that's what motivated him, and to ignore what was happening in the camps?
Well, I think as early as 43, he had information coming in, and especially from some Polish escapees from Auschwitz and I think other Polish concentration camps the Nazis had set up, that there was systematic annihilation of people being gassed and buried in mass graves. And he did say some things in public about war criminals and how at the end of the war there would be a reckoning with these people for their crimes. And of course, the famous story is at the, I think it was the Tehran conference, that Churchill was enraged when Stalin said that at the end of the war we would take 50,000 German officers, line them up, and execute them. And Churchill walked out of the room in a rage, saying that this would be barbaric, and you couldn't do that. And Molotov and Stalin went after him and said, "Oh, we were only joking, you see." But Roosevelt's son, I think it was Elliot, who was there, applauded the suggestion. And they were such volatile times, and they were so concerned, though, not to anger the American public, which they weren't sympathetic to the idea of fighting the war to rescue European Jewry. They didn't want to, as I said about the Poles before, that in the land of 44, only 4% think that millions of people are being killed in those camps.
Well, and the war really matters at this point, too. So when the information is first publicized that there is a Nazi mass murder campaign at the end of 1942, it's only about 3 weeks after the Allies had invaded North Africa. So they're thousands of miles away from the killing centers in Nazi-occupied Poland. And so the reaction of the US government and of 11 other Allied governments and governments in exile was to issue a declaration condemning what they called the cold-blooded extermination and promising to punish the perpetrators. They don't promise rescue, they promise post-war punishment, because at that point, at least at the end of 1942, nobody could think of anything that could be done. And neither country, Britain or the US, were willing to open immigration still at that point.
Nor will Latin American countries.
Or Latin American countries, many of whom had shut their doors entirely specifically to Jews after 1939, or Palestine, for that matter, which was still under British mandate. Yes, sir.
There's a narrative that's taken hold, promoted by Elie Wiesel, that there was a moral failing on the part of Roosevelt and Eisenhower in not somehow flattening Auschwitz or trying to bomb railroad lines going to Auschwitz. And it seems to me, my personal opinion, is that Elie Wiesel had a huge dog in that fight. Everybody he knew went to Auschwitz that way. But that Eisenhower and Roosevelt had a lot of secondary people pulling on them to help Allied POWs, to help resistance in France and Belgium, and that every time the US Army diverted resources to one of these secondary objectives, it was a disaster. When Patton tried to rescue his son-in-law, that was a disaster. When they tried to bomb railroad lines, taking Allied POWs, all they did was kill a lot of POWs. So my question to you is, would it have actually saved any Jewish lives by bombing concentration camps? And if your answer is yes, and it caused the war to go 3 weeks longer, in the end, wouldn't more Jews have died?
Whoa. That's a very good question. So my answer is going to be my opinion and not the opinion of the museum, because I don't think we have an actual consensus about it. I think that to some extent the bombing is a lose-lose. I don't think there's a scenario in which we would look back and see it as a moral success. I think we were either bombing a concentration camp in which prisoners most likely would have died, or we're not bombing a concentration camp, in which case the gas chambers survive a little bit longer. There wasn't an end game for after the bombing had taken place. So when the bombing is first proposed in June 1944, and this proposal never gets to Roosevelt, it never gets to Eisenhower. So they don't have opinions on the matter because it never crosses their desks. I think to some extent it would not have, the Soviets are still 200 miles away. So if you take out the gas chambers, you still have a very large prisoner population that is completely surrounded by enemy territory. And I think the Nazis showed themselves to be very adept at adapting to other killing methods when the gas chambers weren't available. So I think that we struggle with this question because we want so much for there to have been something that we could do. And I have not been able to figure out, in terms of the bombing, what that could be. The way that we presented at the museum is to really open it up to everyone's debate, to say, you know, what is the role of military intervention in a humanitarian crisis? Should we do it? Should we not do it? And let people fight it out. And this is a question that people have been fighting out for 40 years now, including Elie Wiesel, who himself was in Auschwitz when, at one point, the Allies mistakenly bomb it. They're not trying to bomb the camp, but they do it by mistake, and he writes about it in Night. So I think you're very, very right that he had a dog in the fight, and his opinion is certainly valid in this way. It's a debate we're never going to be able to settle.
And the killing in that war was so prodigious. You know, there's been the argument about should we have used the atomic bomb at Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And one of the answers to this is that when they dropped the bomb the first time, they didn't know how much damage it would cause. They thought it would cause massive destruction, but they weren't exactly sure. But what was clear to them was that they had been sending waves of bombers to bomb Tokyo and to bomb a place like Dresden in Germany, the firebombing, which killed tens of thousands of people. And in a way, the attitude was that dropping an atomic bomb was a more efficient way of doing what it took a couple of hundred bombers to do. You see, it didn't seem to them to be some kind of issue of moral recrimination. Now we look back on this because our perspective has changed, and our feeling is that, and the same with the Holocaust, you see, and looking back on it, how could this happen? How could they get away with this? How would they use so much of their industrial strength, in a sense, to slaughter people? To what purpose? To what end? But don't we face this again when we get some lunatic who goes into a school in Connecticut and kills 20 children? For what? To what end? To what gain? But I don't want to make you too cynical, but...
I mean, to add in, there is no debate in this country at the time over whether to divert resources from the war towards rescue. It was a non-starter. Everyone had brothers and high school crushes and sons who were fighting in this war. Even among the Jewish community, there's really no debate. It's end the war as soon as possible. There's really no debate at the time about diverting resources.
Rescue through victory.
Right, rescue through victory. And we can debate that now too, but that was certainly sacrosanct at the time. Yes?
Hi, you mentioned that Eleanor Roosevelt was the greatest First Lady of all time, which seems to me a very strong endorsement. So I'm curious why you think that is and who else might come close and why.
She asked if, she said that you argue that Eleanor Roosevelt is the greatest First Lady of all time, and how do you get there and who else vies for that title?
As they say in French, ich weiß nicht. I don't know. I mean, can anybody think of another First Lady who had her compelling
chutzpah
and influence on the international scene? Let's remember also that she was our first ambassador to the United Nations and was so invested in humane causes, you see. And I had an email yesterday from somebody, you know, the Tappan Zee Bridge, mid-Hudson, they're trying to change the name to the Franklin and Eleanor Tappan Zee, or Franklin and Eleanor Bridge, you see. And so in a sense, you know, she lives on, as well she should. And I just don't think I can think of any other First Lady who comes close to her in the kind of role she played.
I want to make sure we get to all of the other questions, but these are going to be the last ones. So if you think of anything else, feel free to buy a book, and then Dr. Dallek will sign it while answering your question. Yes?
How do you explain, given the policies of Hitler towards the Jews, that Franklin Roosevelt did not accept the passengers on the St. Louis who, as you know, were destined for death otherwise, although fortunately some of them went to England. But what possible reason would he be not to do a simple thing like that, which he was legally entitled to do?
My feeling is that the problem with the St. Louis was that it had become a public issue, you see. If it weren't in the public eye and they could have quietly taken in most, if not all, of those refugees, I think it would have happened. But because it was in the public eye, it was going to touch off a bitter controversy.
I think that's definitely right, and that's why it's different from the Kwanzaa, which is the boat that Dr. Dallek was talking about later. The Kwanzaa was in September 1940. It was a smaller group of refugees, and they were able to stay. The St. Louis is in June 1939. It's over 900 passengers who had been turned away from Cuba. They had Cuban landing certificates, and Cuba turns them away, and they try to get into the US or Canada or another country in Latin America, and none of those countries accept them. For the US, it's in large part because they don't have US visas. The quota was actually filled in 1939. By the time the St. Louis gets...
Excuse me, he could have, I've read about this, he could have done it by fiat.
Yeah, he could have done it by executive order, you're right. And the State Department criticizes that by saying that if there are other refugee ships in the future, what's to stop an organization from getting a ship, filling it with refugees, and trying to get to the coast of the U.S.
And he was also...
It was setting a precedent. And I am not saying that he did the right thing or that the State Department did the right thing in the case of the St. Louis, but there are logical reasons why they acted the way that they did.
And he was at war with the State Department, in a sense. They were so conservative and cautious. Mm-hmm. And he didn't like, as he called them, the striped pants boys.
Yeah, they're very little c conservative, the State Department. It's still the old guard. The rest of Washington is New Dealers, and the State Department tends to be kind of the same people. The heroes of that story are actually the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. They intervene with State Department officials in Great Britain, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France to divvy up the passengers so that none of them have to go back to Nazi Germany. The museum did a project a couple of years ago, and you can see it on our site, to trace the fates of all of the passengers. And what we figured out is that almost a third of them are killed in the Holocaust, and the rest of the passengers, more than 2/3 of them, survive. And so that doesn't change the story at all, but it provides a little bit more nuance, that the US is both the good guy and the bad guy in this story to some extent. Yes?
How can you explain about England and the United States included, they kept on saying that they didn't know about the atrocities for a long time. And the reason I have a question about that, I was still at home. I was actually before occupied by Hungary. I went to Auschwitz as a Hungarian. However, we heard of all the atrocities that were taking place in Ukraine. That the Germans were actually having the Einsatzgruppen going from town to town and just wipe the people out. That's why you have in Ukraine, you have like something like almost 1,000 mass graves they found. The point I'm trying to say, we knew that without newscasts, without newspapers, we heard it. And we knew about it all along, for as early as 1942, 43, okay? From Slovakia, they exported, they deported, I should say, all the Jews of Slovakia early in 1942 or so, and they were massacred in Ukraine. And then another thing mentioned about the escapees from Auschwitz. I know about 2 escapees from Auschwitz that early in the war, when Auschwitz was built, they escaped and they came to they're the only 2 that I knew of that escaped. But anyway, they came out to the west and they informed London. I'm not 100% sure, I think even Roosevelt, and nobody believed them, okay? Another person in this game was Jan Karski. He lived actually in the United States after the war.
Yeah, he taught at Georgetown.
Okay, now he was a courier from the Polish underground to London. He came, he told them specifically what was taking place, and they have not lifted a finger. You talk about bombing?
Right.
Had they bombed the tracks or the bridges from the Carpathian part to Poland, most of us would have been saved. And that is a question I wish somebody could answer.
Yeah, so the question is, why did Americans not believe?
Right.
Yeah. There's information. There isn't a lot of, there aren't journalists. There aren't American journalists there reporting back. And a lot of the information about the Holocaust is really subsumed by war news. And I think that's to some extent the answer, unfortunately, is that there is information. A lot of Americans don't believe it, looking back at World War I. And what information is there is to some extent buried by rationing and going to work for the first time and sending your son to war and all of the other things that were shaping American lives at that point.
And there was a splendid book, there is a splendid book by Deborah Lipstadt called Beyond Belief, in which she demonstrates or points out how so many of the newspaper stories about the horrors that were being perpetrated were buried in the back of the paper. And what also influenced American opinion, I'm convinced, was the fact that people were very cynical about British propaganda from World War I, that they thought that the British had deceived us, and there was still a lot of antagonism to the decision to go and fight in World War I, and there was an inclination to blame it on the British, who had used war propaganda to stir up anti-German feeling in the United States. And so it had produced a certain amount of cynicism and a doubt in the minds of millions of people about what was being said about horrors in World War II.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. I always have to introduce myself by saying I'm from the Caribbean, so I'm not from the United States of America. A small French Dutch island. I grew up in the Netherlands and then came to the United States. So a few remarks. The first one concerning the notion of the bombing of Dresden and Tokyo, where I believe over 100,000 people were burned to death, et cetera, et cetera. At that time, right, I think this is historically, before these bombing took place, there was a debate about the doability, the morality of that. And then after, you know, Nazi Germany doing all it was doing, eventually it was simply decided that this had to be done. So to say that this was only the fact after the fact, I don't think is completely correct. There was some debate early on that this was wrong, right? Eventually, because of the war, this was turned back. Second point is, and this is a much more provocative point I'm going to make now. It could be quite controversial. As far as I know, you said that the first time Roosevelt knew about, or was told about what was going on in the concentration camps was somewhere in 1943. I believe it was early on in 1942, right? As far as I know, it was quite early on that he had known about it, but he was all in favor of winning the war, rescue, you know, in the war and rescue, put an end to Nazism. But I'm asking myself, a country, obviously, like the United States, with its quite controversial history, right? Slavery, genocide of natives and stuff like that. The violence towards my people in the Caribbean, okay? Is genocide all that a big problem for a society like this? I mean, I'm not at all claiming that most Americans are in favor of genocide. I'm saying that in the larger scheme of things, genocide is just one of the factors to factor in, right? And in the war, you could come and say, yeah, bombing the thing, moving, doing this, just not. Let's just focus on what we have to focus, put into Japan and put an end to the Nazis, right? The third point I would like to talk about is the relationship between Roosevelt and the Caribbean, right? Good neighbor policy, et cetera, et cetera. I heard, and I'm not sure about this, but I would like to hear your opinion about it, that he once said, dealing with Haiti, which was at that point in time occupied, and then under the good neighbor policy, as the United States started to back dictatorships in the South, they moved away from that. You know, you control the natives by violent means. He claimed that he had written the Constitution of Haiti on a napkin, right? I mean, there's a certain contempt there, and I'm wondering...
Sir, I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay, so there's 3 points. I mean...
Quick question. One...
So thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Barbara, you have one can we have one question from Twitter, and then we'll...
Yeah, we do have a question from online.
Yeah.
Link Texas asks, what lessons should humanitarian-focused organizations take away from the history of the Holocaust, and how can we work better to call attention to and end humanitarian crises?
So the question is, what lessons can humanitarian organizations take from the Holocaust?
Well, that human beings are capable of the most awful sort of behavior. That's one element. And in fact, there was a novel published by a French author in the 1920s, a book titled Verdun. And in that novel, the author said, what this war, World War I, proved that men can be made to do anything, to kill their parents, their grandparents. And in fact, Japanese propaganda during World War II, they told their soldiers who were fighting in the islands of the Pacific that they should never give up to the Marines, because the way Marines got into the Marine Corps, the requirement was that they kill their parents. Now, astonishing, but Japanese soldiers believed this, and many of them committed suicide rather than be captured by the Americans. And you'd have a garrison of 30,000 troops, and there might be 300 left at the end of the fighting, you see. And so there's a kind of degeneration into a state of nature, primitivism, I don't know what to call it, you see. And I'm not convinced that we've seen the end of horrors and atrocities in human affairs. Indeed, they seem to take place every day, you see. Not just to mention, in the current news, the abuses that some high-profile men have visited on women who are in their employ, you see. So it's part of the human condition. But also, what's so important is that people remember history, and this history in particular. And the last thing I'd say is that's the purpose this museum serves, not to explain, but to keep people asking why.
Right. Humanitarian aid organizations represented the loudest and strongest voice advocating for rescue and advocating on behalf of refugees, like the American Friends Service Committee, which brought Susan and her brother over. A lot of these organizations, the Joint, HIAS, the International Rescue Committee, the AFSC, were the loudest voices during the Holocaust and are still very loud and active voices now. So if that's something that you feel strongly about, those agencies are still around, and you can still get involved with them. So you've had a preview into our deep dive into America and the Holocaust and the role of FDR and his leadership. If this interests you, we have a project going on with the museum where we are asking citizen historians to help us with research. It's called our History Unfolded project. Dr. Dallek mentioned Deborah Lipstad's wonderful book about press coverage. Obviously, no one scholar can look at every newspaper. There were thousands of local and national and regional and college newspapers throughout the country. And so we have a citizens history project asking people to go into their local newspapers and help us find coverage of this history. We help you with giving you events and dates to look for, and then ask you to photograph anything you find. At this point, we have over 12,000 submissions from every state, including Alaska and Hawaii, which weren't states, the Philippines, Puerto Rico. And so if you are interested in that, we're going to have brochures, I think, outside if you're interested in helping us with this fairly massive research project. Also, Dr. Dallek will be signing books upstairs in our donors lounge, which is in the main center of the museum. You can purchase your book upstairs in the lobby and then go up and shake hands and get a signature. I'll add that it's a great gift for armchair historians. It looks great under a Christmas tree or next to Hanukkah candles. I encourage you to pick it up. And please come back in April or May or whenever for the next 4 years and see our upcoming exhibit, Americans in the Holocaust, and participate in future programs. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining, especially Dr. Robert Dallek.